Arcade Heroes.
Get ready!
Greetings, everybody. It's Adam with Arcade Heroes, and this may at first seem kind of an odd thing for me to be covering, which is Hollywood news, but there is an arcade angle to the big news that came out today that Netflix has apparently done a deal to acquire Warner Brothers. Now, I guess we should say tentatively, because as far as I understand, with giant mergers like this, there's all sorts of legal hurdles that may go with it. And I also saw a news source saying that Paramount's really ticked off and that they're going to attempt to do some kind of hostile bid. So who knows? It may end up falling apart or changing in some respect. But assuming that Netflix does end up owning all of Warner Brothers Discovery, um, again, what's the arcade angle? So this is often something that's very confusing to people in the as far as the status of Atari goes, because way back in 1984, Warner Communications, which had owned Atari since I think it was 1976, 77, somewhere around there, they wanted to sell it off really bad because, well, it was Warner's boss, Steve Ross, I think his name was, had really, really, really wanted to get Steven Spielberg on as a Warner Brothers director after the big success of E.T. And so did a $20 million contract to license E.T. For use at home. And of course, resulted in the E.T. video game, which is often blamed for causing the industry crash, which isn't actually true. Sure, it contributed a little bit to it, but there's if you did your research really deep into what was actually going on in 1982, the market was already on its way down before ET was even released. But either way, throughout 1983 and 84, Warner as a company had suffered massive, massive losses, millions, if not billions of dollars in losses. And a lot of that was attributed to Atari. And so they found somebody who was willing to buy off part of the company, and that was Jack Tramiel. And they settled that on June 1st, 1984. And I won't go into all the details, but either way, the what happened there was a split, a schism, where um, Jack Tramiel and the new Atari Corporation ended up with all of the IP rights to everything from Pong up until iRobot, which had just been released actually that month in June. And it's not a very well known game, but it's not exactly the very first 3D polygon game. It's really the first full 3D polygon game. Cube Quest could technically say it used polygons before iRobot did, but anyways. And then everything made by the new company of Atari Games, which Warner still owned at that point, was going to be its own IP. But a lot of people seem to not know this or forgot about this little schism. And so anything with the Atari Games logo, anything that was released after June 1984 to arcades with an Atari logo on it, so Paperboy, Gauntlet, Tubin, Zybots, Area 51, San Francisco Rush, Primal Rage, all of that stuff was under Atari Games and thus Warner Brothers. And there was a time where it was like Time Warner Interactive and some weird stuff like that. I think around the time of Area 51 had that. But what actually happened is that around, I think it was December 31st, 1998, Midway bought Atari Games from Warner, and so that's why a few years later you started seeing there was a Midway Games West, as they called it. They got rid of the Atari Games logo in part due to confusion between the two brands. But the logo, yeah, went away. Like I think it was only Gauntlet Dark Legacy that actually had the Atari logo covered with a Midway logo, and it was that or maybe it was San Francisco Rush 2049 Special Edition or something. That was the very last Atari Games release or Midway Games West release. But then Midway pulled out of the arcade market around 2001, 2002. And then Midway, just chasing console games and all that, as they tried to do between that time and 2009, went bankrupt. And so, for all those who think that arcade ports are a guaranteed success, well, it didn't work out for Midway. And in 2009, Warner Brothers bought Midway. And so, because Midway had owned all the Atari Games IP, they owned all the Williams IP, they owned the Bally IP, that all went to Warner Brothers. And so, when you've seen a new Mortal Kombat come out and it's had the Warner Brothers or the WB Games logo on it, that's because they own it. Now, I've talked with many people in both sides of the industry, console industry and the arcade industry, about Warner before, and it's always been a bit of a nightmare when it comes to the IP. And it's very obvious that the people at Warner had very little idea as to what they actually owned, which is fairly typical. You're not dealing with gamers there, you're mainly dealing with lawyers. And from what I understand, too, Warner Brothers had fairly high turnover on top of that. They've been in dire straits for a while, but basically just, yeah. So now that Netflix, or if it works out differently with Paramount or whoever, ends up buying Warner Brothers, then that means all of that IP, again, Williams, Midway, Atari Games, is going to end up in the hands of possibly Netflix. Now, can it still end up being a thing where they just treat most of it as a ghost, where they just are like they don't really understand what they have? It's certainly possible. Usually with these mega corporations, they really have no idea what it is that they own. There's a story found in a book by Warren Davis where now the name is escaping me, but he talks about he's the creator of Qbert, and Columbia Pictures had owned Gottlieb, and a bunch of legal stuff there. But long story short was that Sony ended up with the Qbert IP, and they had no idea until one time. I think he was at GDC or some other conference, and he came across the Sony booth, and he brought it up to the people there. He's like, "Hey, do you guys know that you own Qbert?" And they had no idea. And they went and checked around, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I guess we do own Qbert." And then they started doing some things with it at that point. But up until then, they just really didn't know, even though Sony's supposed to have, one of the largest gaming divisions out there. But I mean, Netflix has been doing lots of stuff as far as gaming. I know they've been working with Atari, the home version of Atari, on stuff lately, and they've been pursuing some other Netflix games items. And so perhaps there are people there who would actually be like, oh, hey, look, we have all this IP. Well, let's do something with it. But as far as if you've been wondering why you haven't seen a Paperboy remake or a Area 51 or Carnival or any of that stuff, it's because it's been just kind of languishing in the dusty dark of some archive in Warner Brothers, and the only thing they figured is like, oh, we got Mortal Kombat, and that's obviously a cash cow. But they did do Gauntlet, like I think 2013, between 2011 and 2013, they did a new Gauntlet, which was actually pretty good for a console version of the game, but didn't set the world on fire, so to speak. But yeah, so that's all I wanted to talk about for this particular video, and we'll have to wait and see. But I guess for right now, we can just assume that it's going to be a Netflix. All this stuff's going to be under the Netflix banner. Now, is it possible that they could end up selling off the gaming IP to somebody? Perhaps. But I know that was one of the nightmare scenarios. Anybody who tried to license something from Warner Brothers on one of those old IP, because they didn't know what they had, they wanted an absurdly stupid amount of money to do the license, even on something that was obscure. And so it's like if you had wanted to try and license Primal Rage, you'd probably end up paying as much as you would for a Mortal Kombat license, and it's just like that makes no sense to do. But anywho, that is the news. Stay tuned for more IAPA stuff. We'll catch you on the next video.